Welcome to Weird in the Wade. I'm Nat Doig, and although this episode is shorter than many, it is still packed full of weird and wonderful things. Think of it as a stocking filler before the main present next Monday the 23rd of December, when our festive special is released both on BBC Sounds and everywhere else at the same time. You see, it was as I was editing the Beast of Silso episode for BBC Sounds that I realised I could add some recent updates and new witness testimonies to the episode. And of course, I don't want you to miss out. In today's episode, we'll hear from a new witness to the haunting of the Golden Pheasant pub. There's new information about Thelma Roberts, the 1950s UFO investigator, and some medical evidence which could shed new light on the Potton Poisoner case. And at the end of today's episode, I will reveal who the special Christmas episode guest is. Here's a clue. He's known to wear red, and it's not Father Christmas. But first, two new witnesses came forward the very day the Big Cat of Biggleswade episode was released on BBC Sounds. They'd not actually heard that episode, but the day before, a Sunday, they had witnessed a large cat in an area near to Biggleswade where a similar creature had been reported over a decade ago. I will bring you more information on this breaking story in the new year. The Golden Pheasant. Now, when I wrote the Most Haunted Pub in Biggleswade episode over a year ago, I included in it a second-hand story. So, a story from someone else about someone else that I couldn't corroborate. Including second-hand stories is something I try not to do, unless it's already in the public domain, in a newspaper or book, for example. But this time, the occupant of the flat above the pub told me this story, and it was, I thought, just too good to not share. But I was contacted recently by a man who recognised the story, but not exactly as I told it, and he recognised it as something that happened to him. So you can imagine how surprised he was. He couldn't decide if this was a kind of garbled version of what happened to him, or that someone else had experienced something very similar. But he wanted to know and to share his experience. After corresponding with him, and I'm going to call him Peter, though that is not his actual name, I think I was originally told of his experience in a way that would make it harder to trace the story back to him. The person telling me was probably trying to protect their old friend, or maybe just misremembering. As you're about to discover, this happened 20 years ago or more, and especially when you're telling a story that did not happen to you, time wears thin the details. It rounds off the corners, and we naturally over-embroider to make up for these losses. The story I'm talking about is the one of the young girl ghost seen in the flat above the pub. In the previous episode, I say it was a former resident who witnessed this. I say the little girl was singing, but Peter has a different story, and here is what he told me. It's more chilling than the original tale I was told, I think. I have changed other names in this account. Here is what Peter told me. I was in my early 20s. Chris had recently moved into the Golden Pheasant. Chris is a few years my senior, but was a close friend nonetheless. As a way of helping Chris transition into his new residence after having grown up in our home village of Meppershall, a few miles from Biggleswade, our group of friends, approximately 10 of us, decided to sample the local nightlife and the pubs of Biggleswade before retiring back to the unfurnished flat above the pub to sleep in mostly sleeping bags and the clothes that we wore that night. The Golden Pheasant pub was not open to the public at the time, and as I recall, was to undergo some refurbishment before its grand reopening. I had no prior knowledge of the pub, let alone any paranormal occurrences. I woke during the night needing some water, which I had preempted and therefore had a glass to my right-hand side. I remember initially looking across the room to my left and seeing my friends scattered along the floor, all fast asleep and doing their best to stay warm under various blankets, sleeping bags and coats, taking notice of one friend in particular who was sleeping in an awkward position, which momentarily amused me. As I looked forward, I saw approximately 2.5 meters in front of me, in the corner of the room, a young girl, approximately 6 years of age. She was slightly bent over with her hands on her knees. She had short jet black hair, wore a grey pinafore and had polished black shoes on. But the most interesting element was that she was acutely aware of me also. She was looking directly into my eyes with intense curiosity. I stared back for a short while. I then had some of my water and laid back down. I know how this sounds, but I knew she wished me no harm. I was fully aware of her, yet calm. She was just curious as to who we all were and what we were doing there. I woke in the morning and immediately remembered the event. I shared with my friends that I had seen this child, but was met with banter and some ridicule. It was not really mentioned again in the weeks that followed, other than in passing to some of my friends that had been present at the time, but I could not dismiss it. Roughly 2 months later, I joined Chris to go over the road and watch the football, whilst his mum prepared us a Sunday roast at the Pheasant. When we returned, we walked into the kitchen and were met by his dad. Chris's dad said to us, "You just missed it. I saw a ghost going up to Chris's flat." We were obviously startled and inquired more. Chris's dad proceeded to tell us that he had prepared sauces in ramekins for customers having lunch. He left them on one side of the kitchen on the metallic worktops, but had left them there to go into the bar to pull a pint for a punter. As he was in the bar area, he heard a crash in the kitchen. So he immediately darted back into that area to find the source of the noise. But he was met with no grand disaster, no great mess. But the ramekins had been moved to the other opposite worktop. And as he turned around and saw the new location in the kitchen, he caught sight of, and I quote, a young girl running through the door and up the stairs. Now, I remember feeling immediately jubilant and saying, "I effing told you," to Chris. It became evident that Chris's dad had no prior knowledge of what I had seen 2 months prior. I will say that I stayed the night in the Golden Pheasant pub many times after my experience, with no further events other than feeling extremely uncomfortable whilst venturing to the bathroom in the darkness, always feeling a presence nearby, but never seeing anything again. I cannot thank Peter enough for sharing this with us. He must have got such a shock hearing his story being told on the podcast without any warning. I have certainly learnt my lesson about sharing second-hand stories that aren't already in the public domain. One thing both Peter and I are acutely aware of is that, as well as the Golden Pheasant being a beloved Biggleswade boozer, it is someone's home. I don't want to make anyone feel uncomfortable, and the current occupant gladly spoke with me but did not want to be recorded nor to talk about their experiences. Though initially saying they'd had none, they then went on to say that their dog was sometimes spooked and that there were more stories to tell. though I would never push someone to tell me anything that they didn't want to. Peter and I would love to know if anyone else has experienced anything like this at the Golden Pheasant in Biggleswade over the years. As you can imagine, Peter would love to know if there is a former resident who also saw a little girl, or whether it was Peter's sighting that I was told about, albeit slightly differently to what actually occurred. You can get in touch with me at weirdinthewade@gmail.com, like Peter did, or Weird in the Wade is on social media practically everywhere. I'd love to know if you've had an uncanny or strange experience in any Biggleswade or Bedfordshire pub, but especially the Pheasant. And it hasn't escaped me that this is the second story of a ghostly girl who also likes to be mischievous on Biggleswade's High Street. Aggie from the haunted pound stretcher is at the other end of the street, though on the same side, and she was said to wear a pinafore also. Can ghosts haunt a street rather than just one building? I don't see why not, if you believe in such things. And sticking with the Golden Pheasant, I have also met with one of Anne Larman's ancestors. Anne was the poor woman killed by a train at Biggleswade railway station in the 1870s. She may have worked at the Pheasant as a prostitute and be the source of the story of a headless ghost haunting the inn. To meet one of her ancestors who is a listener to the show was both eerie and wonderful. And now, Flying Saucers over Biggleswade update. I also have a lovely update from the cousin of Thelma Roberts, the 1950s UFO investigator with her trusty Labrador dog Mullins. Thelma's cousin wrote to me on the show blog to say, Thelma Roberts was my father's first cousin, my first cousin once removed, though she was more like an aunt to me. She was a real character and had a great sense of humour. I wish she was alive today to see everything that is coming out now about UFOs. I was searching online to see if I could find anything about her, and your blog came up and it was very interesting. Thank you. Thelma's cousin had shared some news clippings with me about an exhibition Thelma organised at a St Albans cinema in the 1950s, all about UFOs, and there's a lovely photograph of her too that I will add to the show blog. I really hope that UFO researchers will begin to explore Thelma Roberts' work and legacy, as she really was a British pioneer in the field. And now, an update on the Potton Poisoner. I was contacted by a listener called Judy, who has a theory about the Potton Poisoner, and in particular what Sarah Daisley's first husband might have died of. Here's what Judy said. My first thought when you described Simeon's cause of death in episode 2 of the Potton Poisoner was that he might have died of an extreme case of quinsy, or peritonsillar abscess. This abscess usually develops on one side of the throat and is a complication of tonsillitis. The symptoms of this are sore throat, difficulty in speaking, difficulty in swallowing, changes in the voice, hot potato voice, like you're talking through a mouthful of hot mash, drooling, fevers and chills, swollen lymph glands in the neck, bad breath, and difficulty in opening the mouth. In the days before antibiotics, this could be fatal, and still can be if not treated, as the swelling in the throat can block the airways and the infection can spread to the neck and lungs. It is possible that Simeon's abscess grew extremely large and caused his tongue to swell, and the swelling in his throat blocked his airway. If his family were too poor to call a doctor, it's quite possible his infection got out of control, and in the Victorian era, sometimes the cure, either from a medical professional or a home remedy, was of little or no use, and in some cases could make matters worse. I don't have a formal medical background, but was brought up in a family where my mum, 3 of my aunts, and a lot of my mum's friends were health visitors, district nurses and midwives, and a lot of my childhood was spent on farms. I also used to help my dad with the farm animals and help treat their ailments. So I tell people that my childhood was a cross between Call the Midwife and All Creatures Great and Small. My friend's son had quinsy recently, which is one of those Victorian diseases that fortunately aren't as common as they were. Luckily, he works in a local hospital in admin, and one of the nurses spotted that he was looking very unwell after going to work with a painful sore throat. He was treated promptly with IV antibiotics and recovered quickly, but he was told that if they didn't work, he would need surgery. This triggered a memory of my mum, aunts and granny discussing quinsy and how it could be a killer before antibiotics, which is why the description of simian symptoms rang a bell. In the past, doctors would lance the abscess if they could, but if the infection had spread, the patient still might not recover. I've treated abscesses in animals and they can get very big very fast. Thank you so much, Judy, for sharing that with us. And I think it does match perfectly simian symptoms. Interestingly, Sarah was said to suffer with her throat when she was in prison. I wonder if that was tonsillitis, which without antibiotics, as you say, could be a killer. Thank you again to everyone who has been in touch with me over the last few months. It really means a lot to me to read your comments and stories. I really enjoy hearing from you. So please don't hesitate to contact me on social media or through the email at weirdinthewade@gmail.com. Next week on Weird in the Wade. Next week on Christmas Eve, Monday the 23rd of December, I have a very special bumper festive episode for you with a very special guest. Here's a clue. As I was interviewing this guest, we had our own spooky moment when an electronic assistant suddenly spoke up, having not been spoken to. And
I'm not quite sure how to help you with that.
Ooh. Could you tell who that was? That's right. Next Monday, the 23rd of December, in a special episode about haunted cinemas, who doesn't love a Christmas movie, I am joined by Danny Robbins of Uncanny, The Witch Farm, and the Battersea Poltergeist fame. We talked about the success of Uncanny, haunted theatres, haunted cinemas, and doppelgangers. You are not going to want to miss this episode. Keep an eye out on social media for some sneak peeks and videos. And make sure you've subscribed to Weird in the Wade. This episode will also be released everywhere simultaneously with BBC Sounds as well for the first time for Weird in the Wade. I know you're just going to love this episode. Thank you again for listening, and don't forget to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts so you don't miss next week's festive special with Danny Robbins. If you're enjoying Weird in the Wade, please consider rating or writing a review where you listen. If your app of choice doesn't let you rate or review, then why not share the podcast on social media? I know podcasters always say this, but it really does help others find the show. If you want more weird stories in your life, and why wouldn't you, then the Patreon might be the space for you. For £3.50 a month, you get extra exclusive episodes and you help Weird in the Wade keep going. Just search Weird in the Wade Patreon or follow the link in the show description. Weird in the Wade is researched, written, presented and produced by me, Nat Doig. The theme music is by Tess Savigear.